go. Connecting to cloud server, etc.
Here they come.
All right, wonderful. We'll give folks a minute or two to filter in. Good morning or good afternoon, folks. Wait a few more seconds while others filter in. Numbers are still rising as people join, and we'll get started very soon. All right, let's go ahead and get started. The first bit here is just housekeeping, so others can keep filtering in and they will not miss much. I'm Celeste Carruthers. I'm an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, where I'm sitting in my office today that I don't visit as much as I would like lately. I'm joined in the webinar by my co-presenter, Jonathan Attridge from the Tennessee Department of Education. And he is going to the extent possible, handle questions and comments in the chat, which as you've probably seen in other sessions so far this week, you can access in a separate window. The chat will be right there, and Jonathan will be handling questions and comments that come up, but periodically we'll stop and he'll raise some for me to reflect on as well. Also joined by David Fields, who will help ensure that things go smoothly for us. David, do things look okay so far?
They do indeed, Celeste.
Great. Audio and visual is working. It's good to check these things ahead of time. Also on the webinars page, you'll see some copy of the slides that I'm going to walk through here, and some supplementary readings, some of which will be referenced in the talk. And I'll also reference some things that are more in progress, but I'm happy to share those by email, by request, and hear your feedback and comments about them. Okay. I think that this is possibly with numbers topping 200, this might be the biggest group of individuals that I've ever spoken to at one time. I'm very grateful for your time and attention today, and I'm looking forward to your feedback and comments, and also a little just anxious about the number of people tuning in, and I hope that it's a good use of your time. If any of you are suffering with COVID, or your loved ones are, or you're affected by the economic recession and the volatility surrounding that, my heart goes out to you, and I'm just very grateful that we're at least virtually able to share some time today, and I hope that you enjoy it. It's a good use of your day. Okay, I should also say, in case I wander into soapboxing or speculating based on the research, that any opinions that I express do not reflect the positions of Tennessee Department of Education, University of Tennessee, or other state entities. Okay, so career and technical education is education about work and about occupation. So I thought it would be helpful to start with a helicopter level view of the workforce today in Tennessee. So the Tennessee unemployment rate was trending down for the last 10+ years before joining the rest of the country and spiking over and close to 15% with the onset of the coronavirus recession, and coming back down a bit since then, but still higher than anything we experienced during the Great Recession. Average annual pay was rising. It's to be determined if the 2020 figure there will show that average annual pay fell or remained steady, or to what extent it changed relative to 2019. So the Great Recession was followed by a long recovery, which has been called a jobless recovery, because jobs did not come back quite as fast as production did and quite as fast as spending did. So after 10 plus years of growth, here we are again with some serious headwinds facing us. The COVID recession has scaled back those slow burning employment gains that the state experienced over the last several years since the Great Recession. Prior to coronavirus, disability and poor health were already prevalent throughout Tennessee, and those have been associated with weaker economic outcomes at both an individual and of an aggregate statewide economic level. Opioid abuse was affecting Tennesseans in greater numbers, and that has been linked to weaker labor force participation and financial insecurities. And also prior to the coronavirus, automation and technology were threatening to take over jobs as firms looked for more ways to save on costs. So jobs are scarce, the economy is reshaping at a rapid and volatile pace around us. And what does CTE research have to offer to these circumstances? Looking across the state policy landscape over the last several years, post-secondary education was a policy priority, in particular during the Haslam administration, with the initiation of the Drive to 55 suite of policies and the attainment goal, where 55% of the working age adult population would have a post-secondary credential or degree by the year 2025. Governor Lee's first legislative initiative was related to career and technical education, signaling a policy priority there, with the governor's investment in vocational education GIVE initiative. And now today, recovery is a top priority as the state kind of looks to navigate the uncertain waters and the uncertain future ahead and come out in a place where people can attain financial security and good jobs again. So when I talk about CTE to economists or to other post-secondary academics, I am careful to make this point that today's CTE is much more than shop class, here represented by my child drilling pilot holes in preschool. Today's CTE includes architecture and construction, that remains a popular career cluster, but also business and agriculture and advanced manufacturing and STEM and health occupations, learning about all of these occupations. And Tennessee, joining most of the United States, offers career clusters in these 16 areas that cover just about any occupation that one could have. In Tennessee, according to US Department of Education data, the most popular clusters among CTE concentrators are business management administration, human services, agriculture, food, natural resources, and by a long shot, health science. Architecture and construction is there at number 5 as well, 5th most popular. I'll pause here before we move into the next section and ask Jonathan if we have any questions or comments that we'd like to highlight from participants.
No comments yet.
Great, okay. So next, I would like to elevate a few highlights from the career and technical education research, focusing on that which has been done in United States settings. And a lot more is reviewed in an in-progress chapter that I'm working on with Chris Jepson at the University College Dublin in Ireland, called Vocational Education, an International Perspective. We call it Vocational Education in the chapter because that's what we call CTE goes by throughout much of the world and throughout much of the last 100 years or so. And that's the scope that we cover in the chapter. This is in progress. I'm not able to post it online, but comments are welcome. Please just send an email to my UT address for a draft. I'd be happy to share it. Okay, so one theme from career and technical education research in both the United States and abroad is that there may be a trade-off between short-term gains to investing in career and technical education as an individual and long-term returns in terms of earnings that you might earn over the life cycle. So career tech ed students typically experience better workforce outcomes shortly after high school. They're more likely to attain employment. They earn higher salaries than their peers who did not invest in career and technical education. And these studies can winnow down and focus on the students who did not necessarily go to college to make that comparison. But the concern is that the skills generated by vocational education may facilitate the transition into the labor market faster, but could become obsolete at a faster rate, particularly as technology kind of catches up to and surpasses the skills that students learned in high school. And this quote comes from a Hanushek and co-authors 2017 study that compared the age to earnings relationship across 11 different industrialized countries, and found that individuals who had invested more in a vocational type of education, which outside of the US typically looks more like a tracked and dedicated vocational education rather than a CTE concentration in a comprehensive high school. But individuals who invested in a vocational education of that form tended to earn more early on, but their peers who had a more academic education kind of caught up and surpassed their earnings many, many years later as they became kind of mid-career and late career individuals. Interestingly, a similar trade-off appears to be evident in STEM skills specifically, where technology advances very rapidly and becomes obsolete quickly. So people, this study that I've linked here that you can find in the slides, finds that individuals who focus on STEM tend to do well early on in their careers, but they also cycle out of STEM as they get into mid-career, cycle into management and other occupations, while younger people with fresher skills move in. But I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of questions left unanswered in this research literature. It's a relatively thin and new part of the economics of education and the education research literatures, including the short versus long-term returns to career and technical education in the modern US delivery, as opposed to kind of a tracked and dedicated European system. One theme that is emerging from the United States research on career and technical education is that students benefit from selecting into career and technical education. And by that, I mean that they benefit in their later careers and in terms of the likelihood that they even graduate high school if they, for example, engage in advanced CTE classes. So there are significant benefits to attaining this depth in career and technical education, taking that third or fourth class in a sequence, that capstone class, that work-based learning type of experience, which we can see in comprehensive high school CTE programs, but also in the early career and mid-career outcomes of students who apply to a dedicated CTE high school, which are less common in Tennessee than in other parts of the country, some of which have been studied in the cited literature here, including Massachusetts and Connecticut. And you can click on any of these links in the slides that were provided in the materials and learn more about those studies. If you're interested in finding one of these studies like that's not behind a paywall and reading more than just the abstract, I'm happy to help run down a working paper or preprint version that you can access for free. But the returns to, whereas there seem to be benefits to moving students, to kind of allowing students to accrue this depth in a particular area of career and technical education, the returns to shifting students into or out of career and technical education by, for example, graduation requirements or other policy that doesn't take their interests to heart, is more ambiguous. It doesn't appear to benefit students significantly one way or the other if they take more CTE or less CTE because of, for example, a graduation requirement. Before moving on, I'll pause here and check with Jonathan to see what folks are hitting on in the chat, if anything.
We have one hand raised in our participant list, and we have one question on we have a few questions. I don't know if we have access to if we're able to turn on the mic for the person whose hand is raised.
Then I can do that. I can give them. Well, I could before, but I can't now.
John Fagan has posted a comment about vocational instruction in the chat, but also his hand raised. Well, while we're doing that, we do have one question. We have one. Can you please touch on why family and consumer sciences is so important? Our administration is eliminating this program of study, and I would love to be able to show how this program of study is important. So, some of the ways that certain programs are valuable or important. Has there been any work on those specific programs of family and consumer sciences, for example, Celeste?
That's a really good question. And there is a little bit of emerging work. Again, I'm not sure it's anything that's posted online that I could share because it's quite new. It's not my own working paper on the individual career returns to different types of CTE clusters, family and consumer science versus STEM versus transportation, so on and so forth. Sean Doherty has a working paper with a Vanderbilt student named Walt Ecton that will speak to some of that. I'm not sure if it's circulating widely. It's one of these things for which we don't have the answers yet, but that there's clearly interest and demand for knowing more about this. Family and consumer science is to me kind of an interesting field because I view it as one that has a lot of outlets for student creativity, but unlike art and music, it is under the CTE and occupational learning umbrella. So, I mean, I agree that it's one that I'd really like to learn more about personally. Jonathan, any other questions we can reflect on now?
That was the only question. We do have the hand raised of the attendees. So, David, if we,
I think if you can make me co-host, I will be able to assist John Fagan with unmuting and.
I think Celeste would have to do that. Maybe.
Oh yeah, could you do that, Celeste? Sorry.
Okay. Pardon me while I look through and see if I can do that. I see.
Yeah, if you hover over my picture in the screen, you should have a square with 3 dots.
All right, you are a panelist. I think I could also unmute Mr. Fagan, but I will make you co-host and do that.
Great. Okay, Mr. Fagan, I'm going to allow you to talk, so you will need to unmute, and then you should be able to voice your question. Can you hear us, Mr. Fagan? It looks like he has remained muted. Now that you have the capabilities, Mr. Fagan, you'll need to there you go.
Okay, I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. As has been going on all week, the chat is locked up, and so I wrote something, but the send button does not work, and I got a little stop symbol on it. So I'll read that. Great point on rapid change. My books are years behind, and my industry changes by the minute. So a perfect example is I spend a lot of time on lighting that has been banned by the government since 2012. So as incandescence, 122-year-old technology, or 23 now, is fading out completely, it's probably 2/3 of my lighting chapter. And my students are sick and tired of hearing about LEDs. But literally it does change by the minute. And so technology that came out, say, to switch your lights on 2 years ago, when the new bulb comes out, it won't work with the old switch you paid $45 for, plus an electrician to hook up. So the whole concept of keeping up with the insanely rapidly changing world of technology and whatever, when your curriculum gets replaced every 5 years with our program, it's outdated before they get it off the press. So that's a whole thing we're dealing with, in addition to all of the other tech stuff. Even right now, the technical problems I'm having with this website are indicative of the world we're all in now, going virtual, and you know, I can't get the send button to work. So your thoughts?
Mr. Fagan,
Yeah.
please try to refresh your screen when that happens with your chat. That's happened to several folks, and including myself from time to time. A refresh generally will fix that.
Thanks, Mr. Fagan. The interplay between education and technology is really an interesting and a long one. Much of the 20th century has been characterized as a race between education and technology, that education was winning until about the 1980s or so. So prior to that, there were lots of new technological advancements that threatened to replace large swaths of the workforce. But at the same time, high schools were expanding, universal high school attendance was becoming more common, people were learning more, and then like taking that knowledge to the workforce and using those new technologies to actually like create more employment. The thinking is that dynamic changed around the 1980s, and we're still kind of in a place where rapid technological advancement kind of threatens to take jobs away. And yeah, there's much more we could get into there, but I absolutely agree. It's a difficult dynamic. I don't watch a lot of hockey anymore, but the expression that always comes to my mind is that you want to go to where the puck is going and not where it has been. And that's very hard to do in education, absolutely.
Good point from a hockey player's point.
Thanks. Being cognizant of time, I do want to move on a little bit into, let's see, there we go. Okay. I want to share a few findings from a descriptive profile of CTE concentrators in Tennessee that Jonathan and I put together last year, that is included in the files that's linked there. The slides that I'm about to show actually update the report with a couple more years of newer data. And this report is part of a policy lab called CTEX, which is organized by Georgia State University, funded by the Arnold Foundation. Over the last few years, we've used this funding to connect K-12 higher ed and labor data from state agencies to better understand the pathways that CTE students take after high school. Some work in this space kind of factored into the state's Perkins 5 planning. And right now we're starting to better understand like why students select into CTE and how cluster participation relates to the labor market. We're grateful for Arnold Foundation's support that helps us do that. So in Tennessee, a CTE concentrators currently completes 3 credits in a program of study, or at least over the years where this kind of figure is representing CTE concentration rates. The percent of regular high school graduates with a CTE concentration has been between 45 and 48% in recent years. Here I'm showing the percent of graduates by their high school graduating class who went directly to college the year after high school. In the class of 2013, there was a gap in college going between CTE concentrators and non-concentrators, favoring the non-concentrators. That gap in college enrollment closed with the class of 2015. Not shown here, CTE concentrators are more likely to enroll in a 2-year community college or TCAT than non-concentrators, and somewhat less likely to enroll in a 4-year school. 2015 was an important marker in the state's recent education policy landscape because this was the first class eligible for free community college from the Tennessee Promise. And that is the same year that the college going gap closed between CTE concentrators and non-concentrators. So looking to graduates who do not go straight to college, CTE concentrators tend to have higher earnings over the 12 months following high school. So this figure plots for those students who go into occupations that are covered by unemployment insurance, where state labor data can help us understand their average earnings. And it shows the average first year after high school earnings for CTE concentrators in black and non-concentrators in orange with the dashed line. And the concentrators, among students who didn't go straight to college, the concentrators tended to earn more in each of the graduating classes that we can observe going back to the class of 2013. And the first year advantage for concentrators appears to persist. So for 2013 graduates who did not go to college, CTE concentrators consistently earned more that first year, but also the second, third, fourth, fifth, up through the sixth year, which is the most recent one that we can observe. So that first year advantage, you can see there for fiscal year 2014, we went ahead and measured it from third and fourth quarters of 13 through 14 up until fiscal year 2019. Before we move into another section comparing Tennessee CTE concentrators to a couple other states, I'll pause and see if Jonathan has any comments from the chat that he'd like to raise now.
I think we're good to move forward.
Great. Okay. So I'd like to share a few figures from an upcoming report, forthcoming by myself, Sean Doherty, Dan Kreisman, and Alfredo Martin, that just descriptively compares CTE concentrators in Tennessee to CTE concentrators in Michigan and Massachusetts, which were two of the other early states in our research lab organized by Georgia State. So Tennessee's concentration rate, which you saw as an orange bar chart a few slides ago, is represented here in a red line graph. CTE concentration is much more common in Tennessee, hovering between 45 and 48% for recent cohorts, than it is in both Michigan and Massachusetts. In the report, we talk a little bit more about some interesting structural differences between CTE in Tennessee, which is predominantly, but not entirely, but predominantly offered in comprehensive high schools as kind of a cluster and elective sequence for many students, versus in Massachusetts, where CTE is much more likely to be offered as a dedicated whole school type of model that students oftentimes apply to enroll in. Michigan is more like the Tennessee comprehensive high school model, also has some dedicated high schools. Their CTE concentration rates have been rising in recent years, possibly because of some funding incentives that we can talk about it more in the report and other kind of papers, that didn't necessarily change the depth at which students persisted in a CTE program in Michigan, but may have changed the likelihood that they were flagged as a concentrator. So in Tennessee, the gender breakdown between among CTE concentrators is roughly even. So males are about as likely to concentrate in CTE in Tennessee as in females, and that marks another significant difference between Tennessee and these other two states that we compare in the report. In Michigan and Massachusetts, males are much more likely to concentrate in CTE than females are. In Tennessee and also the other two states, particularly in the most recent cohorts, Black students are less likely to have a CTE concentration. And in the report, we start to scratch the surface of why that is, and there's more to do there. There's more questions to ask and answers to pursue on why Black students are less likely to be CTE concentrators. But it appears that part of what's happening is some kind of school-specific factors. And so when we look within schools, Black students are still less likely to be CTE concentrators than white, Hispanic, and other non-Black, non-Hispanic students. But the gap in CTE concentration within schools is much smaller than it is kind of looking across all schools across the state, in both Tennessee, in Michigan, and Massachusetts. But this is an area where more research is warranted. So in Tennessee and Michigan, CTE concentrators have similar math achievement. We go back as early as we can in each state and look at 8th grade or 9th grade math. And we've rescaled math achievement test scores in such a way that we can compare them across time and across states. And that's why the vertical axis here goes from like -0.4 to 0.2 rather than a scale score that you might recognize. When we make that conversion to make achievement comparable across states, it appears that Tennessee's CTE concentrators are pretty similar. In fact, they're kind of gaining ground in most recent years against non-concentrators in terms of their achievement. Michigan, likewise, but in Massachusetts, non-concentrators they tend to have higher math achievement than concentrators. See, Jonathan, anything that we can talk about before we move on to more preliminary results about labor market alignment?
We had one comment that was interested in some of the discussion around gender breakdowns, and specifically, I think there's maybe some interesting thoughts on interest in different programs and challenges that we might see in terms of gender equity. I don't know if you had a comment about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So flipping back to some of our more popular programs, flipping way back, sorry about that. There we go. I think I'm kind of speculating now. There is more work to do in this area to be kind of precise, but a couple features about Tennessee's CTE model make it so that I'm not terribly surprised that the gender breakdown is pretty even. One is the preponderance of CTE offerings across high schools of all kinds, across every high school in the state. So that comprehensive high school model of CTE I think makes it more accessible to both men and women. And it also kind of related to that, the clusters that are offered by different high schools, the most popular ones are kind of not affiliated with not necessarily as affiliated with predominantly male dominated industries and occupations as they may be in some of the other states. Health science, business management, and human services in particular are things where the occupations are a little bit more gender balanced than they are in manufacturing and transportation and education and training, for that matter. So that's a lot of speculation, but I think there's more work to do there to understand why men and women are about as likely to concentrate in CTE in Tennessee, but not in other states, what our distribution of program availability has to do with that. And likewise, why Black students are a fair amount less likely to concentrate in CTE than white and Hispanic and other peers. I hope that was helpful. Jonathan, any other questions or comments?
That was the key question, and I think that in some of the other, I just want to comment that in some of our other sessions, and there's conversations around advising and help supporting students. I think one of the commenter noted about how there's more female students who are interested in being doctors or nurses, but fewer that were into robotics earlier in high school. And I know that as we're thinking about, one of the theories is if we expand more of those opportunities into middle school for those pre-CTE courses, which we've seen an expansion of, that there might be an opportunity to expand interest in previously, in fields that have historically been single sex. So I just wanted to note that. But I think that's the only comment we have.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Okay, so now I'd like to walk through, this is very early stage work, and I'd appreciate any comments or thoughts or pieces of feedback that you want to drop into the chat, because that will have a measurable effect on what we do next with this research. But with a graduate student here at UT, I'm working on a report and a longer academic paper on this question of, do CTE students and courses adapt to changes in the labor market? And this speaks to the question of labor market alignment, which is a word that's thrown around a lot. And I would say it's thrown around more than it's quantified and more than it's investigated. So part of what we want to do in this report and the paper that attaches to it is just start to understand and develop a typology of labor market alignment, or some definitions for labor market alignment, and what that looks like in like a static sense. So looking across the state of Tennessee, for example, is the percent of a metro area that is working in advanced manufacturing like correlated with the percent of concentrators, CTE concentrators, who are taking advanced manufacturing. That's like a static type of alignment. We also want to quantify and define a more dynamic alignment. So looking across Tennessee and over time, as the percent of a metro area's workforce gets more or less involved in advanced manufacturing, do we see a corresponding increase or decrease among CTE concentrators in that metro area? So these are type of the things that we're trying to assess, in addition to a more causal question that's reflected here on the screen, like, do CTE students respond to fluctuations in the labor market? I think we can think of a lot of ready examples where this might be happening in the midst of the COVID recession, as we see some fields have become much less prominent, some industries and some occupations become much less prominent, but others become kind of more in demand and restricted. So will students kind of respond and migrate to industries and occupations that seem to be more in demand? This is the type of question that we're trying to assess. I should warn you that just a handful of unpublished statistics are following. These haven't been peer reviewed yet. The policy brief is in progress, but I just want to share a little bit about what we're thinking. So the data that we're bringing to bear on these questions that I highlighted are school level student enrollments in 3 priority clusters that the state is kind of elevating as in demand areas, including advanced manufacturing, information technology, and health sciences. There's no reason that we couldn't do the same type of analysis for other clusters, but to begin, we're just kind of focusing on these 3 areas because they correspond pretty cleanly to specific Bureau of Labor Statistics occupations for which we can observe employment by year, employment estimates by year and by city and county cluster. And those occupations are production occupations for advanced manufacturing, computer and math occupations for information technology, and healthcare practitioner and technical occupations and support occupations for health sciences. So to the first question, which is not really causal, we first just want to examine if CTE students are aligned with local labor markets. And in order to do that, we're going to correlate changes in, so this is a dynamic type of alignment, changes in total course taking in priority clusters with changes in local employment in related occupations kind of at the metropolitan city level. So Bureau of Labor Statistics has different definitions for a metro area that are inclusive of our big cities, but also clusters of more rural counties that don't necessarily operate around one big city, but constitute a labor market where most of the people who live in that area also work in that area rather than commuting somewhere else. And we find that there is a relationship between cluster course growth and growth in related employment. So for an example, if advanced manufacturing employment in a city grew by 1,000 workers, the typical school would see an additional one student in advanced manufacturing, related to that employment growth 1 year ago or related to that employment growth 2 years ago. If health science occupations grew by 1,000 workers 2 years ago in a city, the typical school saw health science enrollment grow by 2 students. We'd like to follow up on this descriptive correlation of alignment with a more causal question. Do labor markets affect CTE course taking? So our students, their families, and their schools are responsive to what's happening in the local labor market with respect to these specific industries and occupations. And so to get closer to a causal answer, we want to test whether an external shock to local employment in a given field have had a chain reaction effect on student enrollment in that field. And the visual that I'm using to illustrate is this desktop toy, sometimes called a Newton's cradle. So we want to take, suppose that we want to take national 2012 to 15 shocks to, for example, manufacturing employment as the instigator of this chain reaction. And we want to estimate interacted with legacy importance of manufacturing in an area, because that instigator of the chain reaction is going to be more potent in some cities and some metro areas than others. We want to see if that affected local employment in that field, and if in turn that affected local enrollment in the affiliated field. Okay, and first of all, we do find a large and expected effect of national employment growth in a particular industry on affiliated employment growth in metro areas, cities, and county clusters that had deeper roots in that industry, where that industry occupied a larger portion of total employment in years past. So we expected to find that and did. So we don't yet find little evidence of a chain reaction effect. I should say little to no evidence of a chain reaction effect on aligned CTE course taking, and also on CTE offerings in those aligned fields within schools, either the likelihood of having any course enrollments in a particular field, and also like the number of unique courses in the field. And so that's at that very high level view, just summing up our preliminary results in brief, we do find evidence of labor market alignment in like a dynamic sense, but we don't find evidence so far of an overall kind of chain reaction effect between fluctuations in the local labor market and corresponding changes in CTE enrollment. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, like fluctuations in the labor market might not reflect or represent where the hockey puck is going, where we want students to go in the end. But it is interesting that at least in a very short term, kind of students and schools are not hyper responsive and reflexive to these short-term fluctuations in the labor market. Again, very preliminary. We want to follow this up by drilling down and focusing more on, whether the results are different by grade. Maybe 9th grade students would be more responsive since they have more time to adapt, by early high school achievement, and by gender, race, ethnicity, and whether or not a school is in an urban or a rural locale. So I want to kind of sum up what a few takeaways that you can hopefully kind of apply to daily practice from the last 45 minutes of the talk. The research suggests that depth matters, as does student interest in CTE. And so as you're advising students about different courses to take, it seems that a higher payoff strategy is to kind of invest in more advanced CTE classes in a particular field rather than sampling a lot of different fields and clusters. The research would suggest that that will benefit individuals more in their early career, at least. Our takeaways from Tennessee's CTE students is that they're not very different from non-concentrators in terms of achievement, gender, and overall college going. So that there is not a stereotypical Tennessee CTE student. They are different in terms of race. We'd like to understand more about why that is and whether there's equitable access, particularly to high quality and in-demand CTE fields across the state. It's to be, we find that CTE students earn more after high school if they don't go to college than non-concentrators. Research from other settings suggests that this may be a causal relationship, but it's to be determined what the longer term returns may be for Tennessee students. And it's also to be determined whether or not CTE students are responsive to kind of fluctuations in the local labor market, as our preliminary results indicate that that's not the case, but we're still working and digging there. As you can see in the slides, I have some additional links and my email address where I'd love to hear from folks in detail. I do want to make sure that I get the session keyword up there to discover. And we're right at time, but I think we can go a few minutes over, and I'm happy to address any comments or questions from the last round of results. Jonathan?
Thank you, Celeste. We had some good discussion about industry needs in our chat, looking for soft skills, and that there's a balance between what sort of training can happen in the within a school and what sort of training can happen on the job. That there was also some conversation around equitable access for Black students and their interest, and I would just for a plug for a session that this Friday that focuses on using career assessments and gauging interest. I think that there's a lot of work to unpack, to unpack some of the equitable differences that we saw today. Namely, is this within school difference where two students are choosing different paths within the same school, or is it a between school difference there? I think we have some more work that we can do. There's also finally a few comments around alignment. There's one hand raised in the chat or in the participant list. If we want to open that up.
Yeah, I can. Heather McIntyre. I can. Yep. You're
Given Heather permission. All she needs to do is unmute. It appears
Great.
she is.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm a marketing teacher, and at our district, they lump us together with business, and sometimes as marketing teachers, we get a little frustrated with that. Are you seeing from your point of view that marketing is going to migrate more towards just being lumped in together with business, or are we going to be a separate animal still?
Jonathan may know this better than I am. I think that it's still marketing and business management and administration are distinct clusters in like the U.S. Department of Ed typology that most states, including Tennessee, have adopted. Jonathan, that's correct, right? Marketing and business are separate clusters?
They are, yeah, and I don't have, we can get back to you, Heather. If you want to send me a message through the app, I can put you in touch with the folks that oversee the standards implementation in that process in case you're interested in that. But in terms of how those two programs are aligned and different, I don't have that answer right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Heather. We still have 160 folks. I don't have any other content to share, but I'm happy to hear other questions or feedback that folks have while you're waiting for the next session to begin. All right. Well, I am grateful for everyone's time and comments and feedback. I believe that we will be able to save the chat. And again, please go to the, there we go. Please send me an email if you would like a copy of any of the in-progress work that I cited here, and I'd welcome additional eyes on that and additional comments and feedback. Jonathan, would you like to say anything else?
Thank you, Celeste, for sharing this information, and thank you, everyone, for spending your afternoon with us and for your work across the state. And thanks for the comments, and look forward to continuing to communicate with you all. Have a great day.
Yeah, absolutely. You as well. All right, David, I think we are ready to pause the meeting or go offline.
Yeah, we can leave it at any time. Wonderful job. Great job.
Thanks. I appreciate it all.
Yeah, I took some notes about how you had the slides on and showing them where the chat and the files are. That was really good practice. Really good. Jonathan, I'm so happy you were here. There were so many questions coming in the chat that I would have been relaying questions throughout the whole session. So it's great you had that information to relay there in the chat.
Great.
Yeah,
Wonderful job.
Much appreciate both of your support at these webinars that I've been in and have done have appeared to work best when there is someone engaging and interacting in the chat like this. I'm very grateful that Jonathan was able to fill that role today.
Right. Well, please let me know if you guys need anything from me, if I can assist you in any way.
All right. And thanks to the 70 of you who are still here. I greatly appreciate everyone's time and feedback. Thank you. All right. Take care, folks.
Bye.
Bye.